Although most of us wish not to another war in the region of southeastern Mediterranean. This is the last of a series of lectures and conferences that have been, and courses that have been organized by the Laboratory of International Relations and European Integration, and I want to thank all my assistants for contributing to bring this conference to organize this conference, as well as my colleagues from the department. And I expect, and we all expect, that our works will be productive. So in order not to lose time, I would like to give the floor to Professor Litsas, who is going to moderate the first panel. Thank you all for coming. I should particularly thank Professor Efraim Inbar from the University of Bar Ilan, Israel, who covered a lot of distance, and Professor David Galbreath from the University of Bath. Amongst us is, you know him, Professor Iphistos and Professor Yannis Eimenis. He came from Rhodes, so I thank them in order of the distance covered. Well, thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning to all. As I'm used to say to my students, the Laboratory of International Relations and the Department of International and European Studies is a crisis vampire. We feed ourselves from the crisis. We choose to maintain a productive stance against the crisis. We do not expect for the sky to fall upon our heads. And this is why we organize great events, I believe, such as this Congress. The main responsible for that is the gentleman sitting on my left, Professor Kouskouvelis, and I would like to thank him for that. Today, I moderate a panel which is about EU in the international system, and I have the honor of being among esteemed colleagues such as Professor Iphistos from the University of Piraeus, Professor Galbreath, Professor in International Security and the editor of European Security at the University of Bath, and Professor Kouskouvelis. I'll try to keep the presenters, on the time framework. However, do not forget that they are full professors and I am just an assistant professor, so if I'm not alright, consider academic politics. Alright, so I'm giving the floor first to Professor Galbreath. Professor.
Thank you very much. I was writing down actually the issue around crisis. It's very interesting, and it really relates to some projects that I'm working on at the moment. Two projects that I'm working on are, and one of them is partly funded by the UK Ministry of Defence, is around crises. And one of these crises is around how science is impacting on the way that we think about security and the way that we deal with certain types of insecurities. And there's a particular crisis in the way that we think about, say, biological and chemical weapons, not to mention the crisis that's going on in Syria at the moment. The crisis around biological and chemical weapons is in the way that these are converging, and all of a sudden you have two separate regimes of biological weapons and chemical weapons that are combining, and no one really knows how to deal with that. Scientists, in a sense, continue to move in the way that they move and explore new knowledge in the way that they do, but in fact the international politics of biological and chemical weapons is much more complex because of the geopolitical structure on which that sits. So we're in a bit of a crisis when it comes to biological and chemical weapons. The other issue that I'm particularly working on, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, is on military transformation, and really on how militaries are transforming in order to meet several new needs. And I don't think that I have to go through much of an extension to say that militaries themselves are in crisis. And that's not to say that necessarily that the militaries don't find a use any longer, as we may see very shortly in the case of Syria, and not to mention many years in Afghanistan now. But more the case that militaries themselves are facing a crisis in terms of what they're supposed to do, why are they used, who are they supposed to be used against, and so on. So I'll talk a little bit more about that perhaps. But the key issue here is that I think that we see crises all around us, and you know, I don't want to be the one of the few foreigners in the room telling you, the Greek people, about crises in any way. Because one of the things that's particularly, I think, really important in understanding what a crisis is something that goes very much to the heart of a paper that I'm presenting at a conference in Leeds next week. And that is this idea of crisis as a constant. And so we understand that crises and the way that the way that they are portrayed as being something like historical events, like we experience a crisis. Yeah. Now, it's not that we are a crisis or that we represent a crisis or something like that, but we experience a crisis. And this is very much the historical event, the historical political event in particular. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I thought it was the mics. The second thing that there's another way of looking at crisis, though, which can go back all the way back to Aristotle. I'm sure you'll be very happy to hear, and probably unsurprised to hear as well. And that is very much the idea of looking at crisis differently. You know, Aristotle very much talked about crisis and crisis as kind of the hemorrhaging of a medical crisis, of this idea of the tearing of the body. And I would say that the Greek financial crisis is very much feeling like that Aristotle. I never hear the Nokia ringtone very often any longer, so it takes me back to when I used to have a Nokia phone. I mean that with all honesty. And with the way that Aristotle was using crisis is very much the way that, in the sense that those who experience or are victims of crisis very much understand crisis. Is this idea of hemorrhaging, of tearing apart, of an invasion in some way or another. Now the thing is that other philosophers like Kierkegaard and others very much talked about this in terms of existentialism. And I'm not necessarily going to take this down too far down a philosophical route, although I do in the paper. But what I would like to say is the way that we talk about crisis and the way that we relate the EU to crisis and the way that we relate, say, even Greece to crisis is very much a problem in the way that we kind of understand and interpret crisis. And the way that we've, in a sense, taken crisis is much less an issue around, in a sense, crisis as a historical event, but rather a crisis as a judgment, or as a moral judgment. This idea of taking crisis as a way to transform, to reimagine, to reconstruct some kind of arrangement. Now, that is, in a sense, kind of an idea that a crisis is not something you experience, it's something that you interpret. And in so doing, by interpreting a crisis, you and yourself are saying that something is not fit for purpose any longer. Now, so when I think about the EU and its crises, that very much comes to heart. Because, in fact, the EU is very much a reflection of its member states and its citizens and so on, in terms of how where a crisis lies and what kind of crisis there is. And so therefore the crisis that is very much being felt in Greece and other countries at the moment is not necessarily the parts of the EU for a variety of different reasons. But the key thing is that not only is a historical event that you're experiencing and that you're victims of in a way, but it's also something that is being constructed. It's a way in which to re-evaluate that which is already the status quo. And that's really what I want to start with, this idea that crisis is something that is and I threatened on Facebook, I threatened to be the one post-structuralist in the room, in a room full of neorealists, just to throw everyone. It was.
There is a fifth column in this.
So this is what I'm particularly interested in, this issue around crisis, and I'm interested in it not only because it is something that is topical at the moment. We're all experiencing crisis as one type or another. NATO is in crisis, Greece is in crisis, the EU is in crisis, Britain and the EU is in crisis, the transatlantic relationship is in crisis, Syria is a crisis, blah, 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 right? What I'm particularly interested in it in a way is it's a way in which, you know, the idea of how we arrive at crises, not necessarily how historically we arrive at crises, but also kind of discursively, how do we arrive at crises is particularly interesting. And in a sense, I mean, that's I don't need to preach Aristotle to you by any means, but I think that going back to Aristotle is, for my own colleagues, is particularly important. Germans always start, quite often they start their academic papers always going back to either Max Weber or Karl Marx. Less so Karl Marx nowadays, but it used to be the case. And I have this idea, even though I don't know it's true, that every Greek paper starts going back to either Plato or Aristotle or something else. But or Thucydides, yeah. It could be the case for my neo-realist colleagues on the table. So for me, what was particularly interesting in the way that this impacts the way that the EU is engaged in international relations. And we can think about the EU as engaged in international relations in many different ways. I think perhaps the most obvious one I originally come from the United States, and so when I think about when I thought about the EU, I thought about the EU as an economic actor. And really an economic actor alone, right? It's common market, has this trade relationship with the United States, has a trade relationship with other parts of the world. The EU is largely an economic actor, and most definitely in talking to the Chinese and talking to the Brazilians and so on, you get this idea that the EU itself is an economic actor, and that's where its primary power lies. And I would even go to the point of pointing you towards, there's an academic at the University of Edinburgh, Chad Damrow, and Chad has a project at the moment looking at, he was saying that in fact, Ian Manners, who's at the University of Roskilde now, he made an argument of which some of you may be familiar with, of normative power Europe. Others made an argument even before that of ethical or political power Europe. Now, what Chad Damrow is doing is something that is quite obvious, but also quite sophisticated in the way that he's doing it, is he's looking at the EU very much in the case of, or in the perspective of economic power Europe, and how this differentiates itself from the normative power Europe concept that Ian Manners and others have used since. We can also think about the EU. Now, the question is the EU's relationship with international relations, is the EU's role in international relations, its economic role, is that in crisis? Do we imagine that the EU is in crisis when it comes to its relationship abroad, outside the EU? In many cases, there's not really a point in that direction. I mean, there's a lot of talk about what the forthcoming years may be like. How will the relationship with China change? Will eventually China be able to, well, many are already arguing that the economic relationship between the EU and China is already in China's favor. And only those like Germany are actually benefiting from that. Let's not go down that road in this room. But the issue there is very much a very it's a very stable one for the EU in terms of its the way that it relates outside the EU. The other issue is really the political issues, the political relationship with that the EU has, and in many ways this was kind of incorporated or encapsulated in something what Ian Manners and others called normative power Europe. It's this idea of not only having the ability to project beyond the EU some idea of an economic basis, but in fact that there's something that what it means to be Europe is a normative meaning. Now, something that something that I was reading very recently came out in Cooperation Conflict, and I just saw a copy of it, in fact, on a desk, and that is Thomas Dietz at University of Tübingen, who used to be in the UK. He has written very recently a idea of normative power as a hegemonic power. So this idea of how do you distinguish, in a sense, kind of the geopolitical power of what we ordinarily mean by power in some way, the ability to persuade, the ability to compel, the ability to coerce. And I'll just take a side moment and say that, in fact, the issue around intervention is being very heavily discussed in a lot of different IR blogs at the moment around what do we call Syria? Do we call it intervention? If we do intervene, do we call it intervention? Do we call it coercion? Do we call it compellence? It's very interesting to call a rose by different names, but anyway. But the issue there is that the idea of normative power Europe is something that is not as stable as the economic relationship with the world, and something that has become far greater in terms of critique. And in particular, that critique is not coming from outside the EU, that critique is coming from within the EU. In many cases, the discussion around norms within what the EU means in terms of some kind of normative fashion is in itself being challenged by the very crisis that the EU finds itself in terms of its own integration. Now, the last thing that I'll say is particularly important in this relationship is the part that really comes closest to my heart, and in my own research, that is the issue around defense. And what I mean in its relationship to security and defense, I don't necessarily mean the EU's relationship, because if we look at the EU and its 27, sometimes count 28, maybe talking about Libyan border missions, 29, even into 30, CSDP missions, you get a sense that, needless to say, you could talk about the EU in terms of defense and security. Yeah, I mean, you could have that conversation, and there's plenty of people who do have that conversation. I'm not really interested in that conversation for a lot of different reasons. One of which is I don't think there's enough there to talk about in a way in order to make some kind of substantial contribution to the study of international relations. And one way, I've never heard that one before. What I think is particularly, please come in, have a seat. What I think is particularly important is the idea of looking at defense in terms of European militaries and the crisis that European militaries are experiencing. And this brings me back full circle, because I think that one of the issues that is particularly problematic for European militaries is really the idea of crisis. And this crisis, and the way that it's being constructed, is thus. European militaries are in a crisis because we have a budget crisis. Even though in Greece that doesn't seem to be really affecting to me, the budget, to the defense budget too much. It is a bit. It is a bit. Too much. I hear. Needless to say, Greece is still the 7th biggest spender, and Poland has just. Greece used to be 6. Poland, after 2012, I believe, became number 6 as having the largest defense budget. 6th largest defense budget. So that's one thing, that we're in a time of austerity. Yeah, we can't do for our militaries what we wanted to do for them any longer. And that means, in a sense, the aircraft that we want to buy, the frigates that we want to buy, the idea of keeping soldiers on payroll, things like this, all these things are being affected by this. And that's most definitely the case. I know the Greek case less well in a way, but in the British case, that's definitely the case. There's a budget. There's a time of austerity for the military. Now the military's trying. Now the military's been told by the government, you have to do more to save money and you have to do more on less of a budget. That is a problem for the military. Problem for militaries because militaries really don't change quickly. Militaries are notorious for being very conservative institutions. So telling them now you have to do more with less is a problem. The second issue is something that is perhaps a little bit more, that has is something that I'll say has two parts. The first part is that there's a change in the way that the public perceives and responds to the military in Europe. That's not to say necessarily that, and so that's one thing. One thing is just that many countries or many member states, NATO member states even, the way that public opinion is relating to militaries, not necessarily in terms of intervention or international intervention. If you look at the public opinion data, you'll see that Austria and Germany are the most anti-foreign intervention of any EU member states. Yeah, that's probably not a great surprise if we look at history. Not to mention their constitutions. But what's particularly important is even in places like Britain and France, the relationship in Denmark and the Netherlands, particularly in Belgium, and so on, is this idea that the European, our militaries are facing an even greater crisis in their relationship with the public. For those of you that know very much the idea of kind of the lead thinker of strategic theory, Karl von Clausewitz, is this idea that, this relationship between the state, the military, and society. And many argue, at least within the British context especially, but I'm identifying this really across parts of Europe, is this idea that there's that crisis between the military and society. Even more so than there's a crisis between the polity or the state and the military. And so, that's a particular problem. It's even more of a particular problem if you think about the way that it differentiates itself between different parts of Europe. So in Britain it's a problem, in France it's a problem, and Belgium and so on, the countries I listed, it's a problem. But if you look in Poland, if you look at Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, they don't have that problem. Right? There is no division. In fact, there's a strengthening. Even yesterday, for example, a Russian, a very well-known Russian political scientist said that if the United States intervenes in Syria, we should intervene in the Baltic states. And this was big news in Russia. Why should it be big news in Russia? It should be big news in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now, the thing is when the Estonians were told what they need to do is they need to get rid of the draft, they said, are you kidding? It would be political suicide for us to get rid of the draft. And of course, we hear that conversation happening all the way down to Greece. So all of a sudden, you've got a defense infrastructure that essentially is having two different needs in a way. Two different needs. The third issue is that it's particularly is what it's been referred to as the capabilities gap, but something that I want to end on, and that is really the idea that when we think about technology and the way that it's shaping militaries, and even I would say it's not only shaping militaries, but it's shaping even the type of it will even shape the type of operations that militaries want to get involved in, even to the point that we can imagine the Americans saying that in fact, we don't really have the technology for that, so we'll use our allies to do that instead. Or, we don't have the technology for that, so we're not interested. And very much you heard that conversation happening around Afghanistan and Iraq. We have good technologies to bomb the hell out of Iraq. We don't really have the good technologies to bomb Afghanistan because there's not a lot to bomb. So, should we really be, Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were really having this conversation at a time. Technology was leading the head. Yeah. As it did with McNamara in the Vietnam War and so on. Now, why this is particularly important, and I'll finish with this, why this is particularly important is that the idea of technology is increasing the rate of technology, the rate of memory, the rate of processor power, and so on is particularly impactful. You already see ISR systems being used extensively by the US military in Afghanistan. So this is reconnaissance, and it's basically network-centric warfare in a small sense of the word. You see in the case of the UK using ISTAR systems, which is very similar but less sophisticated than the American version, where the idea is you can do everything. You can monitor geolocation of every single soldier, you can monitor fluid levels, or you can monitor energy levels, you can monitor to what degree that certain soldiers or units are actually taking the desired route that you've set them on, in the same way that essentially you imagine that you're sitting in front of a games console playing Call of Duty or something like this. I use that phrase, I've never played Call of Duty, but but you can imagine it very similar. In fact, this idea of technology and the way that it's driving the military is particularly important. And the reason why it's particularly important for countries in Europe is that we do not have in many cases, we do not have the willingness, we do not have the budget, we do not have the political needs for such types of technology. And that, in a sense, presents a greater crisis for the EU-US relationship, or sorry, for the European-US relationship. Now, the way this comes back to the EU, defense is particularly an increasing important issue for the EU, not necessarily because those are in EU institutions that are particularly interested in it. What's particularly relevant for the EU is the idea that increasingly, the US is saying, Europe, you need to take greater responsibility for your own defense. Rasmussen, NATO Secretary General, is saying, Europe, we need to take a greater responsibility for our own defense. And now you have ministers of foreign affairs, minister of defense saying the same thing. Europe, we need to take a greater responsibility. Now the question is where that's going to be. Is that going to be, in a sense, an established infrastructure like NATO? Is it going to be an established infrastructure like the EU, or is it going to create something new? That question of what do we do now that we can't rely on these traditional infrastructures is going to be, in a sense, an evolving crisis for the EU in the way that it wants to interact with other parts of the world. I'll leave it there.